Tit for tat. Russia is expelling 23 British diplomats after the UK did the same last week. This and other measures were announced earlier this Saturday after Russia summoned the British ambassador to the country, the latest fallout in the poison attack on a former Russian spy and his daughter. At least 2,400 civilians flee eastern Ghouta, the embattled enclave outside Damascus, as government airstrikes continue to hit the area. Many are seeking safety and emergency services in makeshift government shelters. And in Madrid, around 1,000 people took to the streets to protest the death of a Senegalese street vendor. Mamem Baye Ndiaye died of cardiac arrest on Thursday after reportedly being chased by police. Those are our top stories this hour on France 24. I'm Shona Bhattacharya. Thanks so much for tuning in. The diplomatic back and forth between the UK and Russia went one step further this Saturday. Britain's ambassador to Russia was summoned to the foreign ministry in Moscow as a response to Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson's claim that it was overwhelmingly likely that it was Vladimir Putin's decision to attack a former Russian spy on British soil. Russia says it'll be expelling 23 British diplomats who must leave within a week in direct retaliation for Britain's decision to expel 23 Russian diplomats on Wednesday. That decision was made after the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter, who are now in critical but stable condition. For more on this, on the possible repercussions, let's cross to Thomas Lowe in Moscow. Thomas, tell us more about the measures we've just heard.
Some are quite predictable. Let's start with the 23 diplomats thrown out that have a week now to leave the country, to leave Russia, leave Moscow. Highly predictable. That's typically what Russia's done in the past. Precedent is that they kick out either the same number that have been kicked out by another country, Russian diplomats, or more. So we've got that. In terms of the British Council, this really the closure of the British Council here, or at least the ceasing of its operations in Moscow. Now that also has precedent, but we have to go back to the case of Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with polonium 210 in London in 2006. Now, over the following couple of years, all 9 British Council offices that promote British culture around the world were closed, except for the Moscow office. And now that Moscow office is having to cease its activities. Where Russia's gone above and beyond what the UK measures called for, those measures against Russia, is by ordering the closure of the British consulate in St. Petersburg.
Now, what impact are these events likely to have on Sunday's presidential election in Russia, if any?
Well, clearly this decision has come right before the election. Now, this today is what's called a day of silence. So nothing's allowed to be said on the TV, nothing's allowed to be said in the media about the elections, about who to vote for, about any of that kind of stuff touching the elections. Now, so the fact is that if nothing's allowed to be said, but on what this reminds people of in Russia, because obviously the media is allowed to talk about these affairs, about these measures, these countermeasures, these sanctions, is it keeps in voters' minds what the reasons that people find Vladimir Putin most popular, the fact they see him as a strong man, the fact that they see him as a person who puts Russia first on the world stage, and the fact that he's leading a fight, as many people see it, certainly as Vladimir Putin promotes himself and as the Kremlin promotes him, as a person standing up for Russia against a world that's trying to push it down.
Thomas Lowe reporting there live from Moscow. Thank you so much for those details. Moving on now, and fleeing war without the guarantee of safety. Some 2,400 residents of eastern Ghouta streamed out of the devastated area, with crowds cramming into a government center as strikes continue to hit the enclave. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says at least 30 civilians have been killed so far this Saturday. And since the nearly month-old offensive began, around 1,400 people have lost their lives. Lauren Berstecher reports.
Fleeing eastern Ghouta, exhausted and terrified, these civilians had been trapped for weeks in basements and cellars as Russian and regime airplanes pummeled their neighborhoods with bombs. Yet on Friday, they walked straight into the arms of the Syrian army, which distributed food and water in makeshift shelters outside Damascus.
We suffered a lot. We were detained in the town of Arbin. We couldn't leave until today.
The 5-week offensive has allowed the Syrian government to retake much of eastern Ghouta, a Damascus suburb within mortar range of the capital, and that was mostly controlled by jihadist groups. A 6-day ceasefire between regime forces and the Jaish al-Islam brigade in the city of Douma has largely held, yet bombs have continued to rain on the rest of the province. On Thursday, tens of thousands of people fled the area, marking the largest civilian exodus since the start of Syria's civil war. The UN Special Envoy to Syria reiterated a call for all parties to mark a humanitarian pause in fighting on Friday.
If this is a de-escalation moment, you better try to convince me that this is exactly de-escalation. All what we are seeing on the map looks actually the opposite, escalation.
The shelling of eastern Ghouta, which has already left over 1,200 civilians dead, has also revived diplomatic tensions with the West. Donald Trump's national security advisor warned on Thursday that the U.S. would take action against Bashar al-Assad and his allies if they continued their bombing campaign.
A political target or information leaker, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions fired the FBI's second-in-command, Andrew McCabe, on Friday after the Justice Department watchdog found he leaked information to reporters and misled investigators about his actions. McCabe played an important role in the FBI's investigations of Hillary Clinton and Russian interference in the 2016 election. He says he's being politically targeted. McCabe was fired just 2 days before he would have been eligible to receive a full pension. A diplomatic rapprochement. By signing the Taiwan Travel Act, Donald Trump paved the way for expanded contacts between officials from Washington and China's longtime foe. Beijing is calling foul. Francois Bubeau reports.
The latest jab towards China coming not from a tweet, but from the stroke of a pen. On Friday, Donald Trump signed into law the Taiwan Travel Act that allows members of the United States government to meet with their Taiwanese counterparts. A rapprochement that's sure to anger Beijing, which views Taiwan as a wayward province. For decades, U.S. presidents have officially abided by the One China policy, a cornerstone of Sino-American relations which recognizes the communist government in Beijing as the sole authority over Chinese territory, which includes the mainland and the island of Taiwan. Past agreements have forbidden high-level meetings between White House officials and Taipei dignitaries. In spite of this, Washington has always maintained ambiguous relations with Taiwan by allowing unofficial meetings and selling arms to the island to ensure its security. In November, then-President-elect Donald Trump had even boasted of speaking with the Taiwanese president directly over the phone, drawing the ire of Beijing. The latest diplomatic spat is sure to strain relations between America and China even further after Donald Trump slapped new trade tariffs on foreign goods last week.
Tensions remain high in Madrid after the death of a street vendor. Friday evening, around 1,000 people gathered in the Spanish capital's Lavapiés district that was home to Mame Mbaye Ndiaye. The 35-year-old Senegalese man died of cardiac arrest the day before after he was reportedly chased by police. Catherine Viet has more.
Shouting "No human being is illegal," hundreds of demonstrators gathered in central Madrid to protest police treatment of street vendors.
Every day the police come to ask for our identity papers. I think they should be able to do that job like everyone else. But some of them come as if people had something against them.
Riots broke out in the capital Thursday night after a 35-year-old Senegalese man died of a heart attack while trying to escape a police crackdown on illegal street vendors.
We saw policemen on top of him. They were trying to give him CPR. If they had let my friend intervene, he could have saved his life. But they pushed him away. But they couldn't do anything. The ambulance took 15 to 20 minutes to get there.
All night long, firemen were busy putting out small fires, and explosions from flashbang grenades echoed through the narrow streets of the Lavapiés neighborhood. Madrid's mayor expressed her condolences on Twitter and said the incident would be thoroughly investigated. Friends and relatives of the victim also gathered at the scene, leaving messages and candles to pay tribute to the deceased. Nearly 23,000 people arrived illegally in Spain in 2017, making it the third busiest gateway for migrants trying to reach Europe.
French is the world's fifth most spoken language, and in the next few decades, the number of French speakers around the world is expected to grow, especially in Africa. In honor of the International Day of la Francophonie that's scheduled for next week, here's a quick look at the numbers behind the language of Molière.
There are 274 million French speakers in the world. For France's Emmanuel Macron, speaking French opens doors in an increasingly globalized world. But what many don't realize is that there are more French speakers in Africa than Europe. In 2014, there were 150 million Francophones in Africa, but less than 100 million in Europe. There's another 20 million from the Americas and the Caribbean, followed by 2.5 million in the Middle East and Asia. Finally, around 1 million are living in the South Pacific. By 2050, Africa could account for 85% of the Francophone world. But according to the International Organization for la Francophonie, those numbers could change depending on how the organization's 54 member states choose to reinforce the language's teaching. With a potential for 700 million speakers, French could become the most widely spoken language in the world. But for now, it ranks fifth worldwide, behind Arabic, English, Spanish, and Mandarin, with 848 million speakers.
Bookworms are flocking to Paris for the annual book fair that's in full swing this weekend. Readers, writers, and publishers are gathered to highlight the newest works in contemporary literature as well as nonfiction. This year's international guest of honor is Russia, and as our Rochelle Harrison-Pless reports, politics and culture can make for an awkward mix.
Celebrating the diversity of contemporary Russian literature, Russia is the guest of honor at this year's Paris Book Fair. 38 Russian authors have been invited to showcase their work, shining a spotlight on those writers driving the industry forward today.
Russia's presence here at the Paris Book Fair comes amid soaring geopolitical tensions. Moscow is making headlines as worsening ties between the Kremlin and the European Union are put to the test. Some authors and publishers say this event has nothing to do with politics, while others say they can't be avoided.
What is around me now, I don't like it. Really, I don't like it, because I don't want Stalin came back.
Literature is not a propaganda. Literature is not directed to another political systems, countries, and so on. We writers, we write for us, for our people.
Politics have overshadowed this year's event, with French President Emmanuel Macron boycotting the Russian pavilion.
These authors came here because they have something to say and want to be heard. Assumptions can't be made about all of us, whether it's in relation to those in power or those in opposition. These authors are cultured people, and that's the only link that will allow us to move forward. So it's a shame to associate Russian artistic literary creation with one person.
There are many different views among the Russian authors appearing here at the Paris Book Fair, but they all seem to agree on one thing: the importance of reinforcing cultural ties, even when diplomatic ties are suffering.
And that's it for this edition. Do stay tuned. There's more news coming up on France 24. Do stay with us.